In 2023, out of nowhere, a new lake suddenly appeared in California. And not just some oversized puddle, but a real lake. A proper body of water. It stretched across over 100,000 acres, striking fear and amazement into anyone who heard about it. And you can understand people's reaction when a huge lake pops up out of nowhere. It feels like you're witnessing a sign of the apocalypse. What did I just say? But the more details surfaced, the more interesting the situation became. The media called this lake a zombie because it didn't just appear out of nowhere, but literally rose from the dead right where it had once been drained. However, by 2024, those who came to check out the zombie lake for themselves simply didn't find it. The lake had vanished again. But where could all that water possibly have gone? I don't know about you, but I definitely need a cup of coffee to figure this out. An unobtrusive reminder, only for those who forget to hit the like button, don't forget it. And thanks to those who understand my desire to stay anonymous. There are a lot of interesting things today, so let's kick it off. So the lake, actually it's not nameless, it's called Tulare. And once upon a time, Tulare Lake was the largest freshwater body west of the Mississippi. It was located and then reemerged to the east of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California. Despite its cool status and size, most Californians only knew about Tulare Lake from historical records. It was kind of like there used to be something here, some water that was actually home to turtles and beavers. A bit more knowledgeable folks know that the lake was stretched about 100 miles long and nearly 30 miles wide. However, as local historian Frank Latta wrote in the 1930s, it never stayed still long enough for us to know how big it really was. However, if you overlay the lake during its peak on a modern map, it becomes clear that it would flood a bunch of today's cities. But once upon a time, there were no cities. Tulare Lake was a very fertile place, home to 3 Native American tribes and rich wildlife. On rafts and canoes made from thick reeds called tule, Yokit hunters fished for salmon, perch, and sturgeon, while women ventured far into the water to dig for clams and mussels. There was always so much catch that white settlers named this area Mussel Slough. In the 1870s, amateur fishermen navigated the lake on schooners and steamboats, catching turtles that were served as delicacies in San Francisco restaurants. And the lake has always been there. In this area, there have always been a lot of big rivers, plus melting snow, plus a flat valley with no other way to go. The water just gathered from the mountains and filled the lake. This went on not just for centuries, but for millennia. Once upon a time, the entire Central Valley was one big lake called Corcoran, and it ceased to exist about 600,000 years ago. They figured it could be the size of Lake Michigan, and that's already a big deal. But nothing lasts forever. About 600,000 years ago, a new outlet formed in the San Francisco Bay, which naturally and gradually drained Lake Corcoran. All that's left of it are a few smaller lakes, Buena Vista, Kern, and, well, Tulare itself. Basically, the water's been around here for a very, very long time. Humanity hadn't even reached America yet, and the water was already there. In fact, modern humans appeared in Africa around 300,000 years ago, which means Tulare was around 300,000 years earlier. By the time the lake appeared, Homo erectus had more or less figured out how to control fire. Mammoths still roamed the earth, although they actually roamed around for quite a while. In short, you get my point. Humans hadn't even really become humans yet, and the lake was already there. Civilizations were born and died. Natural disasters happened. Wars broke out. Lake Tulare stayed right where it was. Then came the 19th century. In 1848, Mexico and the U.S. signed a peace treaty by which the U.S. got new territories, including California. At that time, the lake looked like this. It's a piece of a map from 1853. In 1863, it was still large enough for schooners to sail there, but by the 1870s, the San Joaquin Valley started shifting from dry farming and ranching to irrigated agriculture. Farmers teamed up and started forming irrigation districts, building channels and ditches that drew water from rivers onto dry plains. This made the plains suitable for crops. Around this same time, Americans started draining lakes on a large scale to make more room for farming. After creating ditches and channels, they moved on to dams, reservoirs, and drainage systems. Generally speaking, we can say they were pumping water out of one place and dumping it into a completely new one. But this land reclamation didn't stop there. Lakes were drained and local tribes were pushed out. The settlers brought malaria and smallpox with them, chopped down local oak trees that produced acorns, and burned acres of tule reeds to clear space for farming. Starting in 1850, farmers began planting crops along the retreating shoreline. After increasing water withdrawals and a series of droughts, the alkalinity of the Tulare, Buena Vista, and Kern lakes reached a point where their ecosystems collapsed. This happened in 1888. As the water started to drain from the rivers onto the plains, Tulare Lake gradually began to shrink in size. As a result, over 96% of the original 3.7 million acres of wetlands in California's valley were destroyed. This includes Tulare as well. Look, this photo was taken in 1880. A group of unknown men is setting up camp on the shore of Tulare, and the lake is still there. In 1898, there was nothing left of it. This date's considered the first complete draining of Tulare. But what happened next? Why did the lake suddenly rise from the dead after 130 years? In 2023, California was just buried in snow in the winter and then flooded with rain in the spring. One storm after another hit the state, and this went on from December to March. And when the precipitation falls in the Sierra Nevada mountains, the water has no choice but to flow down to where Lake Tulare used to be. As a result, in 2023, it was tough to drive through Central California without stumbling upon a new shoreline of a long, dormant lake. I gotta say, dormant lake sounds better than zombie lake, don't you think? By spring, the lake had covered over 98,000 acres, stretching over cotton, tomato, and pistachio fields and miles of roads. People came here to check out the big water and along the way to see the suddenly returning fish and birds. But even without them, the scene was incredible. Picture yourself driving along a road and it suddenly plunges underwater. And this isn't just a small puddle. There's so much water that it seems like you're driving right into the ocean. Here's the peak moment when Lake Tulare got as big as Lake Tahoe. Plus, along with the lake, the old weather conditions came back, breezes at least 50 degrees cooler and more humid. The depth, to be honest, wasn't much, at most about 6 feet. But for a place where there hadn't been a lake at all just recently, that's already quite a lot. Oh, and by the way, I found out that the lake came back to life not just because of the rain and snow, but because of a phenomenon called atmospheric rivers. For those hearing about this for the first time, let me explain. Atmospheric rivers are relatively long, narrow areas in the atmosphere that carry most of the water vapor beyond the tropics. When atmospheric rivers hit land, they release this water vapor as extreme amounts of precipitation, which can cause flooding, or the revival of a lake. It's a matter of luck. But it's worth mentioning that Tulare Lake is coming back from the dead for the second time. After the lake was completely drained in 1898, the first revival happened in 1906. Then the flooding began, which lasted for 5 years until 1911. And heavy rainfall filled the lake again. Since then, this has happened, so often that it's almost constant. When the rain stopped and the lake dried up, the settlers would plant everything they wanted again, and then the water would come back again, and it'd do this every time right when they had started to forget about the lake's power. So any return of Tulare meant millions of dollars in losses from destroyed crops. For example, in 1937 and 1938, when the floods returned, newspapers estimated the loss of barley, hay, sugar beets, and cotton crops at millions of dollars. It's unclear, though, if this is adjusted for today's money or not. Regardless of everything, even though the lake kept coming back time and again, it never overflowed to the scale of 2023, at least not in the last 40 years. However, roughly every 15 years or so after a record winter storm or heavy spring thaw, dams and ditches can't hold back the rivers. One such flood happened because of an atmospheric river that affected California from late December 1996 to January 1997. Tulare Lake reemerged, covering 56,000 acres, and in some spots reached a depth of 9 feet. Witnesses recall foamy waves rolling past telephone poles, a multitude of birds and fish, and water that was, in places, a stunning blue. But it used to be worse. The local old-timers remember the winter of 1969 when the lake not just existed, the waves on it were so strong they had to shore up the dams with crushed cars from the junkyard. During the last big flood in 1983, the lake almost doubled in size, and it took 2 years to drain all the water. And for those 2 years, people were suffering losses. In fact, many experts believe that the problem lies in the attitude towards the flooded territory. That is, farmers and everyday folk see it as just some land that's constantly getting flooded. It sounds sad, but it's not just land. It's literally the bottom of a lake that was temporarily drained. And this place has been here and existed for hundreds of thousands of years for a reason. There were specific causes, and those haven't gone away. So basically, people built farms on the lake bed, and now they're suffering because their farms are getting flooded when the lake returns to its place. It's like there's a contradiction here. The most recent comeback of the lake impacted 3 distinct groups of people. The ones who were hit hardest, of course, are those involved in agricultural production. On one side, the farmers, and on the other, the producers, which means those who own the land and employ workers. And farming, by the way, is a key industry in this area. Every 4th job here is tied to agriculture. The water flooded what had been a relatively dry landscape for many years, covering acres of crops and at one point even threatening cities in the area. The lake forced the evacuation of thousands of cows, damaged roads and power lines. The local power company made huge efforts to retrieve its submerged equipment. In some cases, helicopters and diving teams were even used. The losses that the lake inflicted on the region's agricultural sector were measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. By the way, scientists and officials predicted that the lake could stick around for many years, causing confusion and fear among local farmers whose lands are now underwater. At the same time, such forecasts thrilled those who viewed the lake as a fertile nature reserve and a sacred place. Now we know that neither fears nor hopes came true because the lake has almost vanished. But it's the ones who are excited about the lake that I want to put into a third group. They were completely unaffected. These are people from the Tachi-Yokit tribe for whom I quote, "The return of the lake became an unbelievably powerful and spiritual experience. They conducted ceremonies on the shore, and also they got to go back to practicing their traditional hunting and fishing practices." The return of Tulare had a special significance for the tribe because in the creation stories, Tachi-Yokit were created from the sediment at the bottom of the lake. This is a super sacred place. Members of the tribe grew up hearing stories about how the lake that once supported them was taken away. Of course, they hoped the lake would stay put and not be drained to restart agriculture like it was in the past. It's just not about traditions. Tulare can help replenish the dwindling groundwater supplies and boost wildlife in the area. Once, there were so many wetland birds here that if you startled them, the flapping of their wings sounded like a loud clap echoing all around. These are the words of witnesses. As I said, every time the lake reemerges, birds of all kinds, pelicans, hawks, waterfowl return too. At least because Tulare Lake used to be part of the Pacific Flyway. It was an important stopover point for migratory birds, and they haven't stopped migrating. Unfortunately, Tulare has disappeared again. It quickly shrank in size when local authorities diverted water to nearby farmland and, well, evaporation? Can't forget about that. Essentially, evaporation is the primary way water escapes Tulare Lake. This is due to the clay at the bottom of Tulare, which prevents the water from leaking underground, keeping it on the surface. In other words, it's either evaporation or humans. There's just no other choice. So what's left where the lake used to be? By the end of March this year, the remnants of Tulare were completely on private land, far from where the public could see it. But you know what's ironic? In times when the lake doesn't overflow, there are dry farmlands here irrigated by groundwater and redistributed surface water. In other words, the soil is literally experiencing a lack of moisture where there used to be a lake. And overall, despite the fact that the San Joaquin Valley in California provides a big chunk of the country's food, it's a dry, arid area. Agricultural fields, vineyards, and orange orchards, grains, cotton, corn, all this is always at risk of flooding. And of course, people live here too. The total population of the Tulare Basin was about 4 million people in 2000. About 4% of the area of the basin is taken up by cities. Again, they're at risk of flooding. You just can't forget about it, especially considering that the climate is changing. Extreme wet and dry periods in California are getting stronger, which means the lake will keep coming back when there's enough rainfall. It looks like there will be rainfall, so nothing will stop the lake from coming back because the conditions haven't changed. Lake Tulare was mainly fed by melting waters from the Sierra Nevada mountains. The mountains are right there. They haven't gone anywhere. The melting waters are there too. They've only one way to go, down into the valley, and the valley's still a low spot where there's no natural drainage for the water to go any further. In short, the landscape hasn't changed, the laws of nature even less so. It's just that people are now trying to use the water that's forming. Seems like it doesn't always work. But they came up with something after all. Today, there are several ways to divert water away from the lake. For example, there are pools for replenishing groundwater that were quickly built along rivers this year to soak up as much rainfall as possible and prevent water from getting into the lake. This is what those pools look like. And they even work. Another way involves pumping water into the San Joaquin River into the California aqueduct, and thus into Los Angeles. This way we can try to distribute water among the users of the 4 dams downstream. In other words, we can put it to use without letting it fill the lake. But there are quite a few people who believe we should stop fighting nature, just leave the lake alone, let it stay in the spot where it's always been. Besides, there are a lot of economic benefits to this decision. Lakes are really useful things. Ecologists are also pushing for the lake to stay. Well, I'm not surprised. Not surprised, and I guess I agree. According to them, the lake will help restore the ecological balance and might make the region more resilient to future floods due to climate change, and changes are definitely coming. Plus, having a lake can help replenish the aquifer. Fresh water is always a good thing. Underground water. Is there some way to keep a balance? Like so that farmers get water and that water doesn't flood the farmland? Actually, yeah, use underground water. Many farmers in the southern part of California's valley have been drawing water from underground for years to support their farms during drought periods. This worked for everyone. Underground water storage prevented flooding of land and provided farmers with water when rainfall was scarce. But water, like any resource in a closed space, isn't everlasting. As a result of constant pumping, underground aquifers, which are like water safes, become depleted. The water level in certain areas in Southern California's valley dropped by as much as 28 feet. However, the situation has changed now, and there's a chance to refill supplies again. Thanks to the melting snow in the Sierra Nevada, a big flow of water is expected. Plus, farmers are worried they might just miss out on the water they desperately need. Just imagine, huge amounts of water are flowing by, and there's a drought all around. Who would like that? Damn, just talking about drought makes me thirsty. So to replenish underground water supplies, the California State Water Resources Control Board has sped up the issuance of permits for these plans. Besides, a lot of money has been spent on creating reservoirs and structures to redirect water from the system. We can't let all that good stuff go to waste. To make this process even faster, like really fast in certain areas like Madera County, farmers are being offered to flood their fields. The point is that when the fields are flooded, water gets into the soil, and that way underground reservoirs fill up more quickly. What's the upside for farmers? They get water for free or at a lower cost. However, despite such a big plus, not all farmers are ready to sign up for it. Some understand the consequences but take the risk for the greater good, and some just wait for the tanks to fill up on their own without risking their land. No swimming. We've already talked about how the lake flooded a lot of farmland and all that. For the locals, it's a disaster, but it attracts a huge number of tourists. Just imagine, a lake reborn. Even though most of it's hidden from view, visitors still want to see this historic lake. And not just that, I mean, what's a trip to the lake without taking a dip once or twice? Actually, Tulare isn't meant for this at all. Because of the flooding, the farmland is underwater along with all kinds of pollutants like diesel fuel, oil, fertilizers, and pesticides. Not exactly great water for swimming. Besides that, at the bottom, there are miles of power lines and other equipment that are crucial for the region's electricity supply. I don't think I need to explain how dangerous that stuff is. Plus, since the body of water is heavily polluted, the authorities don't even recommend fishing there. There's no guarantee the fish is safe to eat, especially since quite a bit of dead fish has been seen floating on the surface. In 2023, there was so much trash in the lake that they even had to get special flat-bottom equipment to clean it because a regular boat with propellers would have gotten stuck. And even if you remove all the trash, you'll just have to start over again. Why? Because abandoned chicken coops, barns, and sheds are slowly falling apart underwater, making the cleanup almost endless. And don't forget, the lake flooded private land, so any swim there counts as trespassing. It's all downsides. The upsides? I don't know, the water's wet? The lake is not for the animals. The Tulare Lake Basin is home to a huge variety of rare animals. Among them are 9 species of invertebrates, 3 species of amphibians, 5 species of reptiles, 42 species of birds, and 13 species of mammals. Some species are unique to this region, some simply live in California, and others are widespread throughout the western United States. You might say that sounds great, but humans have done everything to make life hard for these animals. The thing is, for over a century, human intervention in the Tulare Basin ecosystem has led to a critical decline in local species. The destruction and fragmentation of natural areas, along with the degradation of their quality, resulted in limited access to food and other resources. Plus, don't forget about invasive species. Even plants that aren't typical for this habitat upset the balance of the ecosystem. All of the above is already a huge problem for animals, but it doesn't end there. Mining and oil extraction, along with the use of off-road vehicles, also have a major impact on nature. Add parasites and diseases, the use of pesticides, traps, and animal poisoning to the mix, and you've got a combo of factors that negatively affect animals. Honestly, this would affect anyone. The situation could have been completely different if the lake had come back. It would have been a relief for many species, and some could have even been saved from extinction. But there's little hope for Tulare's revival, and that's a shame. You owe me a like. See you later.